What we want to avoid is something that a lot of people do, unfortunately, which is you have a therapist that's on, Psychology Today, say, and they talk broadly about what their approach is like. When you're having a hard time in your life, it's so good to have somebody there who's impartial, who can, give you the support you need, blah, blah, blah. And then when you look at the problems that they tend to deal with, they're like everything. They're like OCD, ADHD, autism, anxiety disorders, binge eating, anorexia, bulimia, psychosis, this, that. It's like, okay, listen, dude, you don't do all of that stuff.
Hey, everybody. Before we start the show, I want to make a couple disclaimers. This show does cover a wide variety of topics related to mental health and life in general, and some of those could be sensitive for you. I want to simultaneously encourage you to be brave in consuming difficult content, but also respect and recognize your limitations. So please use your best judgment. I will never be offended if you need to skip a question or an episode entirely, but feel free to feel it out, check out the episode, and just see what happens. If you need to skip, that's okay, but, feel free to give it a shot first. I also need to say that while I am a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist, and I'm not your therapist. This is not intended to be direct medical advice, and you should not use this as a substitute for professional help. So with those said, let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 358. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff, aka Duff the Psych. I make mental health content for real people, just like you. And today we have a question and answer episode. If you would like to send me in a question to answer on the show, please send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com or use the contact form on my website, duffthepsych.com. And thank you to everybody who has answered the call for more questions. I've gotten a lot in lately and a lot of really interesting ones, so I very much appreciate it. Helps me out so I don't have to dig deep into the archives to find questions that I haven't covered recently. And these ones are awesome, so I'm excited to share these with you today. I have observed in my professional life, in my personal life, and elsewhere that for some reason, this is a time where a lot of people are having a bit of a tough time. And when I say a bit of a tough time, a lot of people are really fucking going through it right now. So if that applies to you, I'm sorry that you're having a tough time. And I was hoping that maybe you could take a nice deep breath with me and just try to release a little bit of the tension and stress and negative self-talk that might be going on for you. So let's take like 2 deep breaths together, okay? Breathe in. Out. Again, in. Out. Good. Now shake it out. Just give it a nice good shake. That was my kid's Xbox notification thing coming up. Let me turn that down. I appreciate you listening, and whatever you're going through, I think that you're going to be all right. Even if it's not immediately, you're going to be okay, and you can do this. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into the episode. I don't have too much preamble here aside from that. 2 awesome questions, and here is the first one. It reads, "Hi, Dr. Duff. First, thank you for the podcast. You've both helped me with some of my own issues, and you made me more understanding of other people's challenges. I started very sporadic therapy when my job in a call center helping the most financially vulnerable started to break me. That therapy has made me understand that I'm not a glutton or lazy. I'm actually broken on the inside." Pausing here, the title for the email said something about binge eating, just for context. "I wake up seesawing between the horror at my eating from the night before and dreading and anticipating what I'll eat during the next day. I asked my therapist if she could help. While she's interested in the problem, she said straight away it's not her field of expertise and can't. I need to find a path. This negatively affects my relationships with my family as I can't take parts in events and I haven't any friends because I'm scared of being judged, so I stay home rather than attend friend meeting events. I would appreciate any advice you could offer." So thank you for the question, and thank you for your praise in, sharing your experience with the podcast. It's amazing. I think it's so cool that it hasn't only helped you out, but you've been able to understand other people better. That's exactly why I do this. So thank you for sharing that. Your question is a good one, and I'm sorry that you're in a place where you're having to deal with this. I know it can be difficult on a number of different levels. It probably doesn't feel great physically, or maybe it's causing you some physical issues, but you also have the shame and the guilt feelings to deal with, and potentially you even have a fear of losing control. So let's try to get you on track to find the right kind of help and move forward from this. I'm really glad to hear, actually, that your therapist was honest with you about her limitations. I know it sucks to have to search for somebody else, and I know it's hard when you've maybe built a relationship with somebody to an extent and you realize they may not be able to help you with what you're going through. But it's way better and more responsible for your therapist to tell you that she isn't in a position to appropriately help you, rather than just sort of try her best and wing it and possibly send you down the wrong path, or even worse, cause harm inadvertently. So know that that's not a personal judgment on you. That is her doing her job to be ethical and responsible in her treatment of you. And I'm sure I've mentioned before on the podcast, but treating disordered eating behaviors is not exactly the same as doing other sorts of therapy. People who specialize in eating disorder treatment tend to really, really focus on that. And they often have the lived experience that is needed to really empathize with you and understand what you're going through, at least in some capacity. So it is sort of a subspecialty of treatment, much like maybe addiction or things of that sort. Somebody like me, who's more of a generalist, can certainly do therapy with somebody who has disordered eating behaviors, but it's not necessarily my bread and butter. And I would much prefer, if possible, to refer somebody to somebody who just really gets it, and that's what they do. So in that light, here I'm not going to give you a ton of specific advice, but I would like to try to help point you in the right direction and then give you some general things that you can think about to get moving there. What we're looking at here, I think, sounds like some form of binge eating, as you mentioned in the topic for the email, or at the very least, emotional eating. You described having horror at, what you've eaten the night before, which to me indicates probably a lack of control and maybe even a lack of conscious awareness. A lot of people that do binge eat or have some sort of episode of eating related behaviors where it's unlike what they do at other parts in their day. A lot of these people feel maybe dissociated or not totally in control of their behavior. It's almost like they not entirely black out, but they're just in a different state of being, and they don't realize how long it's been. They don't realize how much they've already eaten. They're just in a different mode. And so that does kind of sound like that here. And then in the aftermath, after you're done with this eating episode, you feel guilty. You want to maybe restrict to make up for it. Maybe you're feeling bad and, inevitably that leads you to eat more emotionally. So you binge again, and it's a continuous cycle. So it can be very, very tough. And in this case, I would say that the amount that you're eating, exactly what you are eating, is much less important than the manner with which you are eating, right? So the concern you have about your own behavior, it's clear that this is, shaking you up. You said you're waking up feeling dread, right? And we don't want that. If it's not already obvious, I would say that you should definitely see a therapist that focuses on disordered eating. And when I say that, I mean, this should be abundantly clear from, their online profile. If you go and see them on, say, Psychology Today or like a local website, it should show in their profile that this is something that they specifically specialize in. And if you go to their website, in their about information and about, their education, their approach, things like that, you should be able to see, okay, this person definitely focuses on eating disorders, and this is somebody that I feel comfortable, giving these problems over to help me out with. What we want to avoid is something that a lot of people do, unfortunately, which is you have a therapist that's on, Psychology Today, say, and they talk broadly about what their approach is like. When you're having a hard time in your life, it's so good to have somebody there who's impartial, who can, give you the support you need, blah, blah, blah. And then when you look at the problems that they tend to deal with, they're like everything. They're like OCD, ADHD, autism, anxiety disorders, binge eating, anorexia, bulimia, psychosis, this, that. It's like, okay, listen, dude, you don't do all of that stuff. Maybe you do all that stuff in a poor way. I mean, like I said, I'm kind of a generalist. I work very well with anxiety disorders. I work with a lot of people who have bipolar. I have a few kind of hot spots of what I work well with, and then a smattering of other things. But I'm not going to be on there claiming that I'm really, really good at, say, couples counseling or, eating disorder or something like that, because that's not really, really what I do. But there are a lot of people who are much more interested in popping up in searches than being really clear about their specialties. So have a bit of a discerning eye when you go through the searches when you're looking for a therapist or a psychologist. And on that note, psychologist or therapist, meaning PhD level or master's level, at least here in the US, those are going to be relatively interchangeable when it comes to this issue. I would focus a lot more on what they do, what their specialty is, and what their training is. Aside from finding a therapist that does focus on this sort of issue, I think that it will be important to look at your own history of binge eating and try to understand more about why and how it's emerged. So I would ask questions like, is this something that is new? Was this brought about by working in the call center? Or is this something that you've dealt with maybe more or less throughout your entire life? And I would try to dig into that a bit. Is there any obvious trigger? Are there any obvious sources? What comes to mind when you think about where this came from, how, when, things of that sort? Just doing some self-reflection there. While the management of the behavior itself is important for your health and your safety, meaning actually regulating the amount that you're binging, in people that have behaviors like this, there are a lot of underlying issues that can sometimes perpetuate the eating behavior, or that have been the cause of it, right? So there's often something underlying that brought this about, or at the very least that keeps it going. One research-proven approach to treating binge disorder is what's called interpersonal therapy. And this approach looks at the significant relationships in your life and events or conflicts that could be related to the development of eating behaviors or that uphold these eating behaviors, like I was just talking about. So this could be things like grief, losing somebody. It could be other types of loss. It could be relationship changes, interpersonal conflicts, issues with attachment to your kind of primary caregivers growing up. There could be a lot of things here, but often there's something relational that is underlying this. And so I think that you could do some work on your own, or you could start the process and then continue on with a therapist, kind of getting a head start. But I would suggest doing a lot of journaling and self-reflection and really digging into the different impactful relationships in your life, positive and negative. This could be your parents, mentors, friends, romantic partners, maybe people that have not been a ongoing part of your life, but maybe there's some trauma that's happened because of somebody else out there in the world. I don't know what the case is for you, but thinking about relationships and really just being open to the idea that there may be some influences there and exploring what that might mean. And depending on what you discover with this exploration, there may be some work to be done. Maybe there is a rift to repair between you and somebody else. Maybe there is a history of mistreatment to address with somebody to, stand up for yourself and feel like you have some agency and control in your life. Or maybe there's some grief to deal with and learning to heal from a loss. It depends on what the situation is for you, but, identifying those target areas gives you somewhere to work on. I would also suggest keeping a diary of some type. And to be clear, I don't mean a diary where you log what you're eating in a day, because I think that in this case could be quite counterproductive, right? So we're not going to be tracking calories or looking at what you eat, but instead, what are you feeling like on a given day? Right? So for instance, on a day when you do engage in this binging behavior, what was the day like for you? What were you feeling leading up to that episode? Trying to help yourself understand more about the triggers or states of mind that contribute to the binging behavior. So ideally, you would want to get a feel for how you feel, during the day. If there's a certain type of day or certain type of emotional state that leads to binging later on, what it felt like when you were sort of leading up to the episode, what you felt like, if anything, during, and then what the aftermath was. So really digging into the feelings there and trying to understand more about your own personal patterns. Another area that I think could be helpful for you that you could work on, again, on your own or with a therapist, is just learning skills and coping strategies to better tolerate emotions. So if you tend to binge eat when you have a hard time coping with just the magnitude and how big your feelings are, it could be that there are some skills from, say, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, that could be very helpful. So DBT is, essentially was created for people with borderline personality disorder, but a big part of that is regulating intense emotional reactions. And that's helpful in a variety of contexts, and it very well could be for you too. And a lot of these are familiar. So things like mindfulness training, breathing strategies, grounding strategies. There are many of them out there. DBT loves their sort of acronyms and easy ways to remember different skills. But, you could get a workbook, you can go to a group, you can get some therapy and figure out, what are a few back pocket strategies that work well for you to avoid that boil over point. And with the combination of those two things, you might gain a little bit more control here over the eating. So what I mean is, you've been paying attention, you've been journaling, you've been trying to figure out, okay, what types of mental states, what types of emotions lead to me having a binging episode. Once you get a handle on that, you realize, oh, wow, I came home from work or, whatever in your life might be a stressor, and you're feeling that way. You're feeling like, okay, this is what typically leads me to a binging episode that I later on regret. What else can I do? Okay, let's go to my sort of toolbox of different skills. What can I use instead of eating to bring things down a few notches to the point that I have a little bit more control? And just like for, say, anxiety or something like that, the point isn't to bring you down to a zero. The point is to bring you down to a point where you can take control back over instead of being led on by the, mental health issue that's present. So that's another thing you can try out. And there are tons of different resources for that. I mean, shoot, there's even, TikTok accounts for it, for learning different strategies. You can go crazy with that. And I will also say that, I do understand the desire to isolate when something like this is going on, because there's often a great deal of shame involved with unhelpful eating behaviors like binging. Maybe there are physical changes that have happened because of the binging that, cause you to have some difficulty with self-image or something like that. But either way, you mentioned that it's keeping you isolated. It's starting to prevent you from engaging with family. And that's tough. We don't want that. But at the same time, avoidance isn't necessarily very helpful here. In fact, by remaining isolated, in some ways you could be maintaining that binging behavior. I've said it many times in different contexts of the show, but dragging your issues out into the light and not keeping them a secret is huge when it comes to recovering from them, right? I literally think of it as, a monster under the bed. And when you grab that monster by the ankles and pull it out into the light, suddenly it's still there, but it's not as scary anymore. It's not this unknown boogeyman. It's like, boom, here it is. So definitely bringing this out into the light by talking about it, by being a little bit more open about it, not putting yourself in a position where you're being judged harshly by people that you can't trust or something like that. But if you have loved ones that do get it, that could be helpful, aside from just showing up to family events, engaging socially, maybe confiding in some family members that you trust. This could be terrifying, absolutely. But if you have a supportive and non-judgmental family or support network of some kind, it could really help you improve. And in some cases, it's essential. Aside from that, though, support groups are also a great option. These days, there are tons of in-person and online groups that are available. And support groups for, disordered eating serve as a wonderful addition to the work that you're doing, to therapy, because you can be open about your struggles with people that actually get it. They're not going to judge you harshly because they've been there or they are there. And so you can be a lot more free and realize that you're also not alone in this. You're not crazy. You're just somebody else who is struggling with this because of various issues. But I think that you're on the cusp of making some serious changes for yourself. Maybe it's the case that you've been avoiding diving into this because, you don't really want to know what's under the surface. It's just scary. But I think with a little bravery, some professional help, this does not have to be your life forever. So please consider what I've talked about, finding an eating disorder specialist. In the interim, considering some of the things that you can do to help yourself out or give yourself a head start, and, discovering what those areas of focus for you will need to be. But I believe in you. You got this. And thank you so much for writing in. Before we get into the second question, I want to take a break and talk about our sponsor. Today, the show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Now, in the second question here, we're going to be talking about somebody who's having a hard time figuring out what their goals and path in life are. And that's such a common thing, right? We all find ourselves in positions throughout life where we're faced with tough choices. What do we do with our career, our relationship? Should we move? Should we stay where we're at? And it's really hard to navigate life without some sort of support. And one way of finding support and having a good sounding board to brainstorm with is with therapy. In therapy, you can have somebody who is they have no skin in the game. They don't have an opinion like your family member or your best friend might. They're just there for you to help you recognize what it is that you want and take some steps to get there. So if you're in a place in your life where you could use some additional direction, try giving BetterHelp a shot. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and flexible, suited to your schedule. You fill out a brief questionnaire, and that'll get you matched with a licensed therapist. And if you need to switch therapists at any time, you can do so for no additional charge. So let therapy be your map through life with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/Duff today. Get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Duff. Okay, so on to the second question here. It reads, "Hi, Dr. Duff. I love your podcast. I have been listening for 3 years. I was wanting to send a question in for the podcast. I was wanting to figure out how to set solid long-term goals. I struggle with anxiety, and long-term goals can trigger that. However, it's a bit of a catch-22 because I also feel anxious not having any feelings of direction or idea on how to move through life. Some examples of this are that my partner and I are wanting to move overseas in the next 5 to 10 years, but then I will get anxious thinking of what if our relationship doesn't work? What if I can't save up enough to do this? I guess I just want to know how to set goals and not stress out about them. Thanks always." So thank you for the question. In 3 years, that's awesome. Thank you so much for continuing to listen. It kind of blows my mind that not just you, but many of you have been out there listening for years, not even just a year, but several years. It's wild, but I appreciate you. If I'm hearing the question right, you're feeling daunted by the idea of the future. You're not satisfied with where you're at, but you are scared of the future, which is paralyzing. And then you end up spinning in place because you're afraid to make goals, because what if you can't reach them? And then you don't make goals, then you feel bad, then you feel more upset, on and on and on. You mentioned a lot of what if questions here, and that's one of the first things I want to address. One of the first pieces of advice that I would give is to do what I call defusing those questions. I say defusing like a bomb, right? Because what we tend to do is let what if questions linger out there. And I kind of do think of them like, I think when I think in my mind, the picture of a what if is like this, old timey black round bomb with like a fuse that's slowly burning. It's like a time bomb, right? And we just let them linger there and continue burning without actually addressing them. Because like in the cartoons, if you go over to one of those old timey bombs with the fuse, you can just lick your fingers and put it on there and put them out. So instead of putting them out, we just let them blow up. So they get bigger and scarier until boom. And instead, what I would ask you to do to defuse this is actually answer the question. Whatever that what if is, answer the question. Finish the loop. You're not a fortune teller. You can't predict everything, but you can certainly answer some of these questions. So for example, what if our relationship doesn't work? There are answers to that, right? So that's something that a lot of us would be like, oh God, I don't want to think about that. That can't happen, but it could. Right? It is a possibility. So if you were to go out there, say you moved abroad and you realize that your relationship doesn't work, well, what then? You can answer that. And there's a few things I can think of, right? So let's say that you move abroad and you realize that that's not going to work for your relationship. Well, that would be an accelerated course to understand something that you probably would have realized later on. Maybe it would have been when you bought a house together or started, wanting to have children, or I don't know what your life is like, but some other big thing. And you would have realized later on that you don't work together, but this is a way to accelerate that process. So you would figure that out. And then on the back end, once you break up, you would have to figure out whether you want to finish spending that time you wanted to abroad or move back home, or whether this is your new home. You would have some things to contend with there. You would need to figure out if you want to continue cohabitating or if there's a way for you guys to get some separation so you don't have to feel that awkwardness. And you can go on and on and on, right? You know your situation better than I do. So I would ask you to continue that thread and actually answer those questions. What would that look like? How would you go about figuring those things out? And I encourage you to go all the way to the end of the line, run through what could happen and what you might need to do in a situation like that. And the point here is to stop making these what if questions into these mysterious boogeymen and instead recognize that they're possibilities among many other possibilities. And no matter what happens, you always have options. Options is the operative word here, right? You're not trying to plan for every single contingency or predict every possible outcome because that's not possible despite what anxiety would tell us. Instead, you're recognizing that no matter what happens, you have options and that there is a way for things to be okay, even if they don't work out the way that you expected them to, or things happen that you did not want to happen. The stakes are almost never as high as you make them out to be in your head. And that isn't to say that it wouldn't royally suck, right? It would fucking blow if you moved across, the ocean, went to another country, and then you ended up breaking up. Like, yeah, that would suck. I would feel really bad about that. But I also think that you might be doing a bit of, what I call the anxiety shuffle here, which is where you overestimate the likelihood of something bad happening and underestimate your ability to cope and deal with that if it does happen. In reality, you can cope with things that happen, and the likelihood of bad things happening is less than what if you have some anxiety going on or just the frame of mind that you have, as that would make you think. And what we're talking about here, this can apply to any other scary what if situation that's coming up for you, right? So it's not just this, but anything where you're leaving that lingering question like, well, this could happen. What if this happened? What if that happened? Answer the question, go through, play that tape all the way through and see what you're left with. I wonder if one of the limitations here as well is the pressure that you feel to have solid long-term goals. Like it's just a thing that you're supposed to have, right? Like, oh, well, I need to have these sorts of goals. You don't necessarily have to, right? You don't have to feel solid about your long-term goals yet. You don't need to know exactly where you're going to end up to get started. Take college, for instance, right? There's a lot of people who start college and don't know exactly what they're going to do, but they get, started, and then along the path, they learn more about what they're interested in. They decide on a major, and that maybe sometimes dictates partially where they go in life, and that's okay. It sounds like that might be the case for you, where you have some ideas, but you don't exactly know what you want yet, and you're trying to learn more about that, and that's totally okay. I think that there may be some room for growth here in terms of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy meaning the confidence in yourself, not to make no mistakes and be perfect and, be happy no matter what, but to always recover and figure out what you need to do when it comes down to it. Meaning, you've gotten through every single worst day you've ever had in your entire life, and you will continue to do so. And even if you're in a situation that doesn't work out the way you expected, you're still going to be okay. You have options. So I think that you need to allow yourself to sample, you're allowed to try things out, to brainstorm things, to go on a certain path and leave yourself open to the idea of changing. And you're also allowed to have mixed success with your endeavors. Obviously, there's a degree of, planning and responsibility needed here. You can't completely screw yourself over financially and physically and expect the universe to bail you out. But you can certainly move somewhere and realize that it's not for you and change course. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean you failed. And the moving thing is arbitrary. I'm not saying that that's the only issue here, but anything that's like that, you can make a choice and you can adjust with that choice. You can realize it's not for you. You can realize that you almost got there, but you need to tweak a little bit more. You're allowed to change your mind. That's totally okay. On a day-to-day basis, I wonder if maybe you want to start getting some practice with making decisions that are not completely overanalyzed and overthought. So in other words, sort of allowing yourself to shoot from the hip a bit, which basically means, it's sort of I don't know if this is something that applies in every country, but shooting from the hip, meaning instead of, aiming down the sights of a rifle and, lining up your shot perfectly and taking the shot, just, kind of shooting from the hip, meaning in that general direction and expecting that you'll probably hit somewhere close. So, in other words, doing that a bit and realizing that you don't always get to know the perfect option before acting. There's not always a perfect option. So in daily life, this could be small things like, say you're at a restaurant and you're looking at a menu and you're like, oh man, there's like 5 things that sound good. Okay, I need to take some time to really consider what's best. What do I really want? You're kind of thinking about what you've eaten recently. You're thinking about what's coming up, what you might regret buying, what you might not regret buying, and overthinking that. And instead, just arbitrarily picking one, being like, man, those all sound good. Okay, the third one, let's go with that. And letting that be. It sounds kind of dumb and kind of small perhaps, but these are small steps that can lead you to feeling a little bit more confident in the fact that you can choose whatever and you're probably going to be okay. Similarly, maybe you leave the house, you get in the car and go, and do that before you figure out everything that you're going to do when you leave the house. Small things like that. And in this way, you're basically inoculating yourself somewhat to the uncertainty that comes along with making decisions and building a little bit of confidence in your ability to adapt along the way and challenging that notion you have in your head about the stakes being so high for everything. I also want to suggest maybe a little bit of an unorthodox method here. It's been a little while since I've talked about AI or ChatGPT, but it continues to be a very, very powerful tool for me and many others. But tools like that, especially ChatGPT, can be a really great way to brainstorm. And essentially, you could use the program as a coach. So if you're having trouble developing goals and considering the steps that you need to get toward those goals, you might try opening up a conversation with it and asking for help. So like if it were me, I might open up a new chat and say something like, I'm having trouble formulating goals for my future because I find them overwhelming. Here's where I'm at right now. I am however many years old. I'm doing this with my life. Give some context. Do you have any ideas for me? Here are things that I care about. What questions would you want to ask me? That's one thing you can do with these AIs too, is you can say, ask me any questions you need to, fill in the picture. And ask it for help. Do you have any ideas for me? Do you have any questions for me that might help us develop some bigger goals together? And from there, you can also have it help you break goals down into chunks. So if you were to say, I'd like to move abroad in 5 years to Japan, what are the sorts of things I need to figure out now or have settled before that time? And you can keep talking back and forth until you have a little bit better of an idea about the realistic picture of what that would take, what that would look like. One of the things about your situation is that it might be a little hard to talk to people about this because maybe you're a bit embarrassed or maybe you're a bit just stressed by the overwhelming nature of the topics. And so in AI, it has no feelings, has no judgment of you. You can throw it all out there and see what sort of collaborative brainstorming you can do. And if the conversation or the brainstorming isn't going the direction you want, you could delete it and start over, right? You can always adjust. And so there's a lot less at stake, at least is what it feels like, a lot less social judgment or whatever when you're doing it in this way. But aside from, our robot overlords, it may also be the case that you need to talk more with your partner or other trusted loved ones about things that are important to you. What is important to you in life? What do you see in your future? What are your values? What things do you care about? And these can be helpful because they serve as these compass headings to see if you're pointing in the right direction. If you have an inkling to do something like move or change careers or make some sort of change in your interpersonal life, rather than solely focusing on the pros and the cons list of, okay, what's good about this, what's bad about this, you can ask yourself, how well does this line up with what I want in my life? How does this line up with my values and what I care about? And that can give you some direction, right? Even if you don't pick the perfect choice, if you're doing so in service of your values, you're not going to really regret it later on. You're going to be like, okay, that one was a miss, but I understand why I did that because it's important to me. So to answer your overall question, right? So how do you set goals and not stress about them? I would say first, realize that stress is a normal part of it. If you're trying to do big things, you're going to feel some degree of stress, and that's okay. But you can learn to think of plans and start moving toward them regardless of the fact that you're stressed, right? It's okay that you feel stressed while doing this. Start with communication and introspection, learning more about what you want. Talk to your partner, talk to people you trust. Do lots of brainstorming and thinking about what it is that you want out of life. Then find ways to break those goals into smaller and smaller components. You can set some timelines for yourself and realize that every step along the way is in service of your future self. You're allowed to change your mind. You're allowed to fail. You're allowed to find avenues that you never even considered along the way. All of those are okay. But approaching is what's called for here. And if approaching in the way that you have already is just too big, then start smaller. Scale back until you find a place that you can start, but then don't stop. Keep pushing forward, keep approaching. And along the way, you're going to learn to better tolerate the questions and stress and things like that that come up from thinking about your future. So I hope that's helpful. I believe in you. You can do it. And that's what I had to say here. So this is the end of the episode, everybody. This has been episode 358 of the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. If you like the show notes, go to duffthepsych.com/episode 358. And if you'd like to send me a question for the show, send me an email to duffthepsych@gmail.com. Take really good care of yourselves, and I will see you for the next one. Bye.